On this day, the 24th of February, 1525, the death of Richard de la Pole, the last White Rose. Tudor Foundation Mythology was keen to paint 1485 and the Battle of Bosworth as the closure of a period of bitter civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. In Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the two sides were joined in marriage. Their children represented the union of the two roses as one, and their eventual heir, Henry VIII, personified the end of the disputed period of succession. Except that the story we're told isn't really true. Henry VII faced constant Yorkist threats, from the Lambert-Simnel affair in 1487 to Perkin Warbeck in the 1490s, but one more threat goes largely forgotten. The de la Pole family were the children of John de la Pole, 2nd Duke of Suffolk, and his wife Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the daughter of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, so her children were the nephews and nieces of Edward IV and Richard III. The oldest of her sons, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, was viewed by many as heir presumptive to Richard III after the death of the king's only legitimate son, so their claim to the throne was seen as very real. John was involved in the Lambert-Simnel affair and was killed at the Battle of Stoke Field in 1487, a conveniently overlooked battle of the Wars of the Roses during the Tudor era. After Perkin Warbeck and Edward Earl of Warwick were executed in 1499, the remaining de la Pole brothers, who had been trying to show their loyalty to Henry VII, broke cover. In 1501, just before the marriage of Prince Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, Edmund and Richard de la Pole, the oldest and youngest remaining brothers, fled England for the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. The brother they left behind, there was another but he was in holy orders, was arrested and thrown into the Tower despite the fact that he hadn't joined his brothers. Edmund and Richard had travelled through Calais, where Sir James Tyrrell was in charge. It was for this collusion, not for anything to do with the princes in the Tower, that Tyrrell was arrested and executed. Edmund began to call himself Duke of Suffolk, the White Rose, and openly laid claim to Henry VII's throne. In 1504, Henry VII signed a treaty with the Hanseatic Merchant League that was detrimental to English merchants. The most likely explanation was the insertion of a clause that prevented the Hanse from supporting Edmund de la Pole. It was in this same year that a conversation at Calais had been reported to Henry in which the succession was discussed. Some favoured the Duke of Buckingham, others Edmund de la Pole. To Henry's horror, no one championed his son's cause. Luck came to Henry's rescue in 1506. Emperor Maximilian's son, Archduke Philip, was shipwrecked on the south coast of England. Although not expressly a prisoner, it was made known to Philip that he wouldn't leave England until he had signed an agreement that required the handover of Edmund de la Pole to Henry. Maximilian had little choice but to agree. He made Henry promise that Edmund wouldn't be harmed before sending him from Mechlin to Calais, from whence he was bundled off to the Tower. On the 30th of April 1509, to celebrate his coronation, King Henry VIII issued a general pardon. There were some exclusions, and top of the list was Edmund. His name was followed by his brothers William, who was still a prisoner in the Tower, and Richard, who remained abroad. In 1513, as Henry prepared an invasion of France, King Louis XII offered Richard de la Pole support, mainly as a distraction to keep Henry occupied. On the 4th of May, Henry had Edmund quietly executed in retribution. Immediately, Richard began to style himself Duke of Suffolk and White Rose. Louis recognised him as the rightful King of England. In 1514, the French king gave Richard huge sums of money and an army. John, Duke of Albany, the Regent of Scotland, agreed to take Richard to Scotland to launch an invasion of England from there. On the eve of Richard's departure, Louis suddenly signed a peace treaty with Henry and withdrew his support. Richard had served the purpose Louis had had for him. By now in his mid-30s, Richard was proving a very capable soldier. He served Louis in Italy in an attempt to win another crack at England. When Louis died in 1515, he was succeeded by Francis I, a close friend of Richard's. Henry panicked. He ordered Thomas Wolsey to arrange an assassination of Richard. Percival de Matte, Captain Simon Francois, and Robert Latimer are all recorded as being hired to complete the task, but all attempts failed. For a decade more, Richard evaded Henry, travelling around, serving the King of France, proving himself an able soldier, and attracting Yorkists to his growing following. On the 25th of February 1525, Richard took command of the vanguard of the French army at the Battle of Pavia in Italy. Francis's army was crushed by the Holy Roman Emperor's forces. Francis himself was captured, and Richard was amongst those killed. When the news reached Henry, he ordered bonfires lit throughout London and a Te Deum sung at St. Paul's in celebration. It's hard to know whether Francis's capture or Richard's death pleased him more, but I suspect it was the latter. The final chapter of the De la Pole threat didn't close until 1538, when Sir William died, still a prisoner in the Tower of London. He represents an interesting piece of tragic trivia. His 37 years as a prisoner makes him the longest-serving inmate in the Tower's history. Richard de la Pole was a serious threat to Henry VIII, not least in Henry's own mind. Although Richard was a pawn in the games played between the King of France and the King of England, Henry celebrated the death of the last white rose threatening his crown on this day, the 24th of February, in 1525.